There's a lot here for one sermon, but I'm just going to forge ahead to try to spare us from a part 3. If it gets to be too much content, we do have this nice wood paneling up here without any iconography where you can fix your gaze and let loose your imaginations. Last time in part 1, I spoke about the meaning of the body for our Christian lives and a certain model that we get in our own tradition and certainly in Catholicism, a model coming out of a reading of Genesis in which our bodies are a wonderful gift of God, not hindrances for the spiritual life, but integral parts of it, helpers in it, as long as we honor God's original intention for them, which is tied to the heterosexual love between Adam and Eve. Pope John Paul II called this the spousal meaning of the body. I then spoke of a second model or understanding of the body that we also find in Christian tradition. And this tradition takes seriously Jesus' statement in Matthew 22 that we read last time, that in the resurrection, we neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like angels in heaven. This tradition understands our bodies not in terms of their beginning, but in terms of their end. Not in terms of our earthly birth from sexual union, but in terms of our new birth from above. The life we are somehow already living in the resurrection that Christ has brought, our eternal life. I'd like to talk a bit more about this second model this morning, as this is something I'm exploring in my dissertation. And we can start by looking at what some of these early Jews and Christians actually thought about angels and angelic bodies. We heard in our Isaiah passage this morning a description of the seraphim, who are traditionally the highest order of angels, the angels closest to God, and the ones we named our daughter after. In his vision, Isaiah sees them each with 6 wings, 2 covering their faces, 2 covering their feet, and 2 used for flying, and maybe also for holding tongs, unless they have arms for that. This reminds me also of the visions of Hildegard of Bingen in her Book of Divine Works, and all the wings she describes there as part of her visions. When Ezekiel sees angels in the cloud, he also describes them as having a somewhat human form, but with 4 wings instead of 6, and each one with 4 faces: human, lion, ox, and eagle. And angels don't just appear in human or animal form. When Moses comes to the mountain of Horeb in Exodus, there the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of a bush. He looked, and the bush was blazing, yet it was not consumed. One can assume that these visions are just that. Just visions or appearances, something taking place inside the imagination of these writers. But early theologians weren't dismissive like that. They wanted to understand how these could be real events, not just perceptual phenomena like hallucinations, but real things being perceived. In other words, bodily realities. And this required some philosophical work. Angels were typically understood to have bodies of their own, like all created living things, But these are what they call spiritual bodies, not made up of visible earthly elements. So it had to be explained how they could make a visible appearance. Augustine thinks about this in Book 3 of his work De Trinitate, on the Trinity. The angels, he says there, could either have taken a bodily form from a material creature for the purpose of carrying out their ministry, just as each one needed at the time, or else, through the power granted to them by the Creator, they could have converted and changed their own body itself, to which they are not subject, but keep in subjection to themselves, into whatever bodily appearances they desired that were suitable to and in keeping with their actions. So those are the two options Augustine comes up with. Angels either take pre-existing earthly elements and kind of step into them for a time, or they change their own spiritual bodies into those elements. And we get some insight here into what a spiritual body means. Augustine says it's something to which they are not subject, but keep in subjection to themselves. That is, their bodies don't limit them in their freedom. They are free to use them and even change them as they wish, according to their divine purpose. Augustine is drawing on early Jewish theorizing about the spiritual bodies of angels. The same beliefs that Paul, I think, is drawing on in 1 Corinthians 15, when he's describing what it means to be born from above. So it is with the resurrection of the dead, he says. What is sown is perishable, what is raised is imperishable. It is sown in dishonor, it is raised in glory. It is sown in weakness, it is raised in power. It is sown a physical body, it is raised a spiritual body. If there is a physical body, there is also a spiritual body. Thus it is written, the first man, Adam, became a living being. The last Adam became a life-giving spirit. But it is not the spiritual that is first, but the physical, and then the spiritual. The first man was from the earth, a man of dust. The second man is from heaven. As was the man of dust, almost done here. As was the man of dust, so are those who are of the dust. And as is the man of heaven, so are those who are of heaven. Just as we have borne the image of the man of dust, we will also bear the image of the man of heaven. Paul makes these statements after describing how Jesus appeared after his death. Appearances in which, like the angels, his body looks different at different times, and walls and locked doors don't seem to trouble him. In John 20, he somehow reconstitutes himself inside a locked room, not once but twice. Jesus is no longer subject to a body, but it is subject to him. He seems to have the wounds of the crucifixion in his hands, but it's like he's chosen to appear thus so that he'll be recognized. Some of these early mystics will say, as I hinted at last time, that he also chooses to appear male for the same reason, that is, so people will recognize him. And the Bible gives intimations of Jesus' spiritual body even before his crucifixion, when he walks on water, for example. His body seems to obey his will in ways that ours just doesn't, or at least doesn't seem to. Christ is described here as a standard or model for us, not only sometime down the road after we die, but in this very life. Paul hints that when we follow Christ as Christians, when we accept Jesus in our hearts, we are putting off our old selves and putting on the new. In the words of Ephesians, we are taught to be renewed in the spirit of your minds and to clothe yourselves with the new self, created according to the likeness of God in true righteousness and holiness. In Corinthians, as is the man of heaven, so are those who are of heaven. And he means here angels, but also us. So what does this mean? What does this actually have to do with our bodies here and now? Is it metaphor? Is it magic? For Eriugena, the 9th century mystic I focus on in my studies, this is quite real. He says at a few points that we create our own bodies, meaning here not our spiritual bodies. These are something God has made as an integral part of ourselves, something always with us, he believes. But rather, these visible mortal bodies of earthly elements. He reads Genesis like this. When Adam and Eve are described as naked and then sewing fig leaves for themselves, Eriugena gives reasons why we should understand that nakedness as referring to their spiritual bodies and the fig leaves as their mortal bodies. And this is something we sew together or create in a few different ways. A fairly common sense way in which, as a species, we create the bodies of the next generation from ourselves by sexual reproduction, but also individually. You know the saying, you are what you eat. We are constantly replacing cells in our bodies with new ones. Of the 30 trillion cells in our bodies, we replace around 330 billion every day, and not one cell will last a typical lifetime. Science. In this sense, we are on a daily basis creating our bodies from the soil of the earth. And Eriugena was quite aware of this science, as were people all the way back to the ancient Greeks. I've been speaking last time and in the children's story this morning about the mutual relationship between soul and body, and how things we do with the body, like exercise, have an impact on our mental health. Well, what we eat certainly affects our mental states as well. So that it isn't just that your body is what it eats, but you are. Gregory of Nyssa is one of Eriugena's heroes, and he has some great writing on sleep and dreams, and how what we have eaten will impact our dreams in certain ways, with the implication that food impacts our waking thoughts as well, often in ways we don't consciously discern. There are also more mystical ways in which Eriugena thinks we create our bodies. Like in dreams, where we generate these kind of dream projections of ourselves, so in our waking lives, he thinks our bodies, our visible bodies, are in some ways unconscious projections of our souls. And part of the Christian path for him, awakening to the wisdom of the resurrected Christ, is an increased awareness of the spiritual nature of our bodies, and hence control over their visible projections, so that our bodies become subject to us, fully within our control, and we are able to make them better images of what is truly within our souls, fully malleable instruments of our purpose. I'd be very curious to hear your reactions to this kind of language, to this understanding of being born from above. Some may hear a liberating message in this. Not necessarily in the whole projection thing, but in the general idea that humans are more than their bodies and might someday be able to appear as they see fit. And I think here in particular of those who struggle with bodies they don't feel especially reflect what's in their soul, and who feel their identities fragmented because of this. There is certainly a message of wholeness here, of body cooperating with mind and soul, which is like the ideal of health we suggested last time. But it also doesn't hurt to be critical here as well. Just as we can be critical of a Christian model of body, which understands it as a gift of God, but goes on to specify very precisely what this gift entails, regardless of individual context. So we might be cautious about a model which views the body as an object rather than subject, not an integral part of our identities as human, but a tool for using however we want, especially when what we want isn't always what is best for us. And when we know that things we do with our bodies tend to ripple up into our minds as well. For Eriugena, our bodies become perfect images of our souls only when our souls become perfect images of the divine. But it's easy to forget that latter part and assume we can do what we want with our bodies, medically, technologically, and what have you. It's easy to forget that suffering in the body, suffering with us as we suffer now, was part of Christ's liberating ministry. My rule of thumb here is to try to remember that how I understand my body, either as a crucial part of my identity and my relationships that I should honor as it is and try to build my spiritual life around, or as an instrument of that spiritual life that I'm called to tune accordingly or change or augment to reflect what I assume are clear thoughts about my own purpose. Or if there's some other good or even biblical model of how my body figures into my Christian life. My rule of thumb is to remember that bodies are different. And just as bodies are different, so are the roles that they play in different spiritual lives and identities. And to deny this, to assume that what makes sense for me ought to make sense for every bodily being, is a form of color blindness that can distort my relationships with others. In conclusion, as much as I like to think that even now my body is a fully malleable instrument of God's will, it certainly isn't completely malleable to my own will. And for me, at least in my ignorance, that's probably for the best. Or else, who knows what animal shape this face might take on. But if my end, if my purpose and ultimate goal is an unhindered vision of God, to cling in eternity to the divine will, my life culminating in prayer to her like the seraphim singing holy, holy, holy all day long, I want my body to be involved in that. My breath, my voice, my ears, my tongue, my memories. For now, much of my day still consists in following my body around, feeding it, cleaning up after it, etc. But that doesn't mean I can't already do these things prayerfully. The shape that our prayer takes doesn't just have to be sitting down. If we learn to pray standing up, walking or wheeling around, dancing, doing the dishes, if we do these things with love and serenity, giving thanks in all circumstances, maybe that's our contribution to making that invisible love and serenity real bodily things in this world, and getting us all closer to those seraphim who pray without ceasing.